Hello and welcome again to another episode of The Mind and Us with your host, Christiana Joseph. Today, we will be speaking about a topic which is rarely spoken about in the psychological health field. I want to talk to you today about suppressed emotion. We'll be looking at what is suppressed emotion and also what may cause suppressed emotion in males, females, in children, etc., the public at large, and also some techniques to address suppressing one's emotion. We'll also be looking at what impact suppressed emotions can have on your psychological health, your psychological well-being as well. As always, on The Mind and Us, we aim to simplify mental health so that anyone can understand. So we will not be using a whole lot of jargons. We will be breaking down suppressed emotion in its simplest form so everyone can understand. Before we start, I want you to do something small. Whether you're driving, hopefully you're not watching this while you're driving, walking, washing dishes, or lying in bed. Just notice for a second how your body feels right now. Not your thoughts, your body. Is your jawline tight? Are your shoulders up near your ears? Is there a knot somewhere in your chest, so that feeling of tightness in your chest? Or tightness or funny feeling in your stomach that's been there for a long time. So long that you've stopped noticing. Just hold that thought. We'll come back to it soon. I want you to hold that thought and hold that feeling. As a mental health nurse, I've spent years sitting across from people in hospitals, in the community, on the ward, and different corners of the healthcare service. And listening to what happens when feelings don't get felt, when feelings are ignored, or how should I put it, when feelings are suppressed, or it's pushed down, or it's boxed up, and kind of filed away under, I'll deal with this later. Today, I want to talk to you about that suppression of your feelings, about suppressing your emotions and what they are, what they can cause you, what they cost us, and why they show up so differently depending on who you are in the world and what the world expected you to be from the day you were born. So we're going to be looking at the impact of suppressed emotions, the impact of not allowing these emotions to come to the fore. So we'll be focusing on, particularly on women, teenagers, and men, because I've noticed in my work that suppression wears a different mask depending on your gender, who you are, and various other factors. But before we get there, let's talk about what suppression actually is. What is emotional suppression? There's a difference between processing an emotion and suppressing an emotion. They're two different things. Processing an emotion looks like if something happens, you feel a reaction. You let yourself feel that emotion. Maybe you cry, maybe you talk about it, maybe you sit with the discomfort for a while, but you actually allow yourself to feel that emotion. And then over time, that emotion moves through you. It doesn't vanish, but it settles a bit. And it becomes part of your life story instead of like a splinter stuck under your skin that you can constantly feel, but you ignore and you feel. Again, suppression looks a bit different. When you suppress an emotion, something happens, you feel a reaction, and often, even without deciding, you shut it down. You don't allow the emotion to shine through. You tell yourself, I don't have time for this, or this isn't a big deal, or other people have it worse. Yeah? You swallow it up and you just carry on like nothing has happened. You just continue. And on the surface, it can look like strength or being tough or being resilient. Sometimes people even praise you for it. And they would say, you're so calm, you're so strong, nothing seems to get to you. Have you ever had people tell you that? You're so calm, you're so strong, you're so resilient. But what I've learned from both research and my years working with patients and in my own life, I would say, emotions that don't get processed, they don't really disappear. They get stored in the body, in the nervous system, in the way we relate to others. And eventually these suppressed emotions find a way out. And usually not in the form that we choose or we would like them to find their way out when they eventually get out. I like to think of it like pressure in a pipe. You can cap one end and for a while nothing happens. The water still flows somewhere contained, but the pressure builds up. And it doesn't just evaporate, it comes out somewhere. Sometimes a burst pipe can be a big visible crisis. More often, in my experience, it's a slow trickle or a slow leak. And that's how suppressed emotion works when it starts to come out. It can come out in your sleep, in relationships, it can manifest in your physical health, and just in your well-being, in who you are. It starts to manifest slowly. And there's solid research behind this too. Studies on emotional suppression consistently linked it to increased activation of the sympathetic nervous system. And as I mentioned in the video I did about stress, that's your fight or flight system. Even during seemingly normal moments, it can manifest. People who habitually suppress emotions tend to show a higher baseline of stress levels, higher cortisol. Again, as I mentioned in the video a couple weeks ago about stress. And sometimes they show more cardiovascular strain. That's what the research has shown. And this surprised me when I first learned about it, because they also said you can have worse memory problems because you're trying to constantly suppress. So suppression doesn't just hide the emotion from other people. It distorts your own relationship with your experience. It sometimes tells you your experience is something different to what you're actually having. And psychologically, suppression is linked again and again in the literature to higher rates of anxiety, depression, chronic stress, and even physical illness. When you don't allow your feelings, whether it's sadness, to manifest and to deal with it, sometimes you feel constantly exhausted. It's this exhaustion of trying to keep holding in these emotions and keeping it under the surface, but it's still somewhere in your body. What I want to really be clear about, I want to be clear about something, because I don't want this to sound like you must express every emotion as it arrives, or you always have to, if you feel upset or angry, just blow up all the time. That's not what I'm saying. That's not what I mean. It's not always safe or appropriate either to express all emotions at the given time. And there's a real skill in choosing when and how and with whom to share difficult experience or difficult emotions. So that's not what I'm aiming at. But what I'm talking about is the difference between a choice to hold your emotions in for the right moment to deal with it, yeah, and a habit of never letting yourself feel a lot of your emotions at all, even when you're alone, even when you feel safe, even in your own head, you don't allow these emotions to be set free. Suppression over time doesn't just affect your mood. It can change how you experience yourself. And people who chronically suppress often describe a kind of numbness. They often say that I feel numb to things, to events. And not just feeling bad, but they get numb to feeling good too. Joy gets a bit duller. And sometimes emotions can be hard to access. I guess you can't really selectively choose when to be numb or not. Even like if someone is experiencing grief or anger, sometimes even love, because they're constantly suppressing emotions, they don't even experience those emotions as well. And I've sat with patients where people have experienced really bad situations or relationship breakup and other stuff, and they just continue to function as if nothing has happened, like literally nothing has happened. They constantly suppress. So the question is, why do we suppress our emotions? Why would anyone choose to disconnect from themselves or how they are feeling? It's an interesting question, which I always thought to answer. And more often than not, it isn't really a choice. The person doesn't choose to suppress their emotions. It's a survival strategy. People learn to suppress their emotions, and usually for very good reason. For example, a child who cries and is told by the teacher, the parent, etc., to stop crying, or they're constantly told to stop crying, they learn very, very fast that crying is not acceptable, or there's some negative repercussions to crying, maybe even physical repercussion. A teenager who expresses anger and is punished for expressing anger, they soon learn to swallow their anger. Of course, they need to express it in an appropriate forum, but who is told they mustn't express their anger at all? And an adult in a high-stake job who allows themselves to fall apart at work might genuinely lose their livelihood, so they have to keep it together, even if they're feeling that work is difficult or it's challenging, because they can lose their job and they can lose their source of income. And suppression often starts as being adaptive, really. The problem isn't that it worked once. The problem is when it becomes the only tool in your box, or the only tool in your arsenal for every emotion that you have. And it's used everywhere and for everything. And it's always used. Suppression is always used as a means of dealing with the emotions that you have. That's what suppressed emotion is about. It's not about suppressing your emotion temporarily, but using it in every situation. And that's really the difference between suppressing your emotion and dealing with it later on, or suppressing your emotion and constantly doing that and never really dealing with it. The message we receive about which emotions are acceptable in life, really, and from whom, is really important. And in what context. And this shapes whether we accept emotions and deal with it, or we constantly suppress. And sometimes this can be gender specific, age specific, and it can be a cultural thing. Different cultures accept different expressions of emotion as compared to other cultures. As I mentioned earlier, we'll be looking at the teenagers, males, and the females in terms of suppressed emotion. So let's look at 3 groups. And so we can break down suppressed emotion. Let's start with women. Let's look at women, suppressed emotions, and how it impacts women and what can be done. This research has shown be the ones who suppress their emotions the most. Now, I want to be careful here because no group is monolithic. Every person's story is their own. So not all women would fall into this category, but there are patterns sometimes. And I've seen that clinically, and the research has shown that women tend to suppress emotions a lot. Men do suppress their emotions as well, but we're going to focus initially on women. For many women, the emotions most likely to be suppressed isn't sadness, it's anger. And think about it. Think about the reason why for women, anger tends to be the emotion that's most likely suppressed. Think about the language we use. A man who is assertive is usually called a leader, yeah? And a woman doing the same thing is often called difficult or even bossy or too much, or maybe having a nervous breakdown. Girls from a very young age are frequently socialized to be agreeable. They're told that women must be quiet, kind of basically seen, not heard in some cultures as well. They must be agreeable, they must be accommodating, they must keep the peace. Anger in a lot of homes and the workplace is treated as unfeminine, unladylike. So what has that taught women that they mustn't express anger? In society, women who express anger is looked at something to be softened. Generally in society, women, instead of expressing anger, they convert it into a feeling of or expression of disappointment, or it may be dressed up as tears, or it may be redirected inward. So women don't usually, as I said, I'm generalizing, I don't mean all women. They don't usually express anger as readily as men because society has taught us that women should not be expressing their anger. And this is part of the concern, what concerns us clinically, that anger isn't allowed to be anger. And sometimes, very often, it becomes anxiety or depression or chronic self-blame. I can't count how many men I've worked with or I know who came to me with that. On the surface, they seem fine, or they seem like they're suffering with anxiety disorder, or racing thought, or a tightness in the chest, or they may be having sleepless nights. And when you really dig deep into what is causing some of these signs and symptoms underneath the anxiety, etc., underneath that uneasy feeling, sometimes it's legitimate, sometimes it's justified, but sometimes it can be suppressed anger because something has happened to them and they weren't allowed to express that they're angry. So they have internalized it, tried to suppress it constantly, and it has turned into anxiety or racing thoughts or some physical health problem. Let me give you another example. This isn't any one person. It's a picture built from patterns I've seen many times over. What the research shows and what I have seen in life itself, being a woman, being around women. And it's not details of any real patient or anyone that I know. I'm just talking about the pattern. So this doesn't relate to anyone. Picture a woman in her mid-30s. Let's call her a nurse, I'm a nurse. Let's just use that. She's a nurse and an office manager and a mother. She comes in describing chronic fatigue, tension, headache, and knot in her stomach. And these are constant feelings and they won't go away. And she also has this growing sense of dread every morning before going into work. So these are some of the signs and symptoms that the person is displaying. On paper, as a clinician, it may look like generalized anxiety. So she may be diagnosed with generalized anxiety. But as we talk over several sessions, after you build up that trust with the person, a different picture started to emerge. She'd been doing the vast majority of invisible labor at home. When I say invisible labor, I mean all the family things, all the things that you'd expect a woman, a mother to do. Scheduling, the emotional caretaking of everyone around her, the remembering of birthdays, appointments, and just who needs what she needs to stay on top of, what she needs to do, that sort of stuff, a lot of things. And she's in a full-time job on top of all of that. And she's absolutely exhausted. She's exhausted. She's furious, actually. She just don't have the words for it because somewhere along the way, she's learned that a good woman, a good mother, a good employee is supposed to be able to cope with everything. She doesn't get angry, or she shouldn't get angry. She shouldn't get angry about carrying more than she can actually cope with. So instead of anger, what she has is the signs or symptoms of anxiety. She's feeling this racing thoughts, this persistent nagging guilt because she isn't coping and she cannot actually express her emotions. Sometimes she may not even ask for help because the fear of someone judging her and saying that she's supposed to be able to cope as a woman with all of that, but she can't. So we're focusing on anger. So that's what suppressed anger often looks like in a woman. It's not rage, but it's more exhaustion. It's not like fury, but feeling more guilt, more like a stomach ache that lasts for a long time, like nervousness. And that's because women are told from the minute they're born, they're supposed to be mothers, they're supposed to still work, they're supposed to do everything else and actually just cope, be good wives and just cope. And if they express their emotions around that, negative emotions that is, then they may be judged a bit harshly. So that's an example of expressed emotions in a woman. With women, there's also a pattern around emotional labor. And more broadly, the expectation that women will manage not just their emotions or their feelings, but also everyone else's around her too. And that's an expectation of a lot of women. For example, a woman would be expected to comfort a partner, comfort her children, and not be in a bad mood. The woman is usually expected to be the emotional glue of the family. That's why she's learned to suppress her emotions. And when you're constantly attuned to other people's emotional state or other people's emotion, your own can end up at the very bottom of the pile or the very bottom of the list. Not because the woman doesn't have emotions, but because there's no room left for her to express her emotions, or no one is really asking about how she's feeling. So that person has learned to suppress their emotion. They have no other choice. You also have postpartum experience. When we spoke about perinatal mental health with Dr. Galumba, postpartum experience is another place where we see this vividly. There's enormous pressure on new mothers to appear grateful and glowing and fulfilled because they've just given birth to a baby, even when the reality actually includes grief, sometimes resentment, fear, tiredness, or a complicated mix of love and being overwhelmed. But that doesn't fit into how a new mother is supposed to present. And we're not talking about mental illness here. We're talking about someone experiencing these emotions, different emotions to what society say they're supposed to experience when they give birth. Women sometimes often describe feeling that they're not allowed to say, this is really hard, or I've missed my whole life, without the feeling of being ungrateful or unfit, because society don't accept that. So they smile in public and sometimes they fall apart when they're alone or quietly, sometimes in their car or in the shower when no one can see. And still, it's better to express your emotions like that instead of keeping it suppressed, instead of keeping it inside. And then there's the way that suppressed emotions in women often get catalyzed as instability rather than being understood as a rational response to a real situation or to real conditions. A lot of women, if you look at the olden days, when women expressed their emotions, they were seen as mad, mentally ill, and they were locked up. Historically, women were labeled as hysterical, a word which has a genuinely ugly medical history, rooted in the idea that women's womb caused their distress. And that history isn't far behind us. It isn't that far as we'd like to think. Their womb will cause the problem, or them just being a woman. The net effect is a double bind, really. So you suppress it, and it turns into a physical illness or depression. And you express it and risk being dismissed or pathologized. And neither feels safe for women. It is just very complicated. So what helps? We look at the issue and we think we have to answer what helps. In my experience, the first step is often just acknowledging it, just naming it, giving someone permission to be real and to express themselves, giving yourself permission to be real, to express your emotions, to be able to say, hey, I'm angry, and I'm allowed to be angry. I'm tired, and I'm allowed to be tired. I'm sad, and I'm allowed to be sad. Learning to separate the emotions from the fear of how it will be received by others. Journaling privately, where no one is watching or judging, can be a powerful first step. A lot of women who write down their emotions, a lot of people actually, who write down their emotions can be a really powerful first step because it lets the emotion exist. It allows you to pour it out in that forum. It lets it exist without needing to be managed or softened for an audience. So those are some really good tools as well. Also therapy that validate anger or any emotions rather than immediately redirecting it towards calm can be transformative for some women. So they're allowing the woman to be angry instead of saying, look, you need to be calm, control the environment. Some women have literally never been told by anyone that their anger makes any sense or they're allowed to be angry. They've been probably told by family, friends, partners, children, society at work, you can't get angry. Being angry is not a valid feeling. And practically, this is something I say to almost every patient, another woman who I know in life. regardless of what we're working through, physical movement can be one of the most effective ways. I mentioned this in the video about stress as well. Physical exercise, for me as well, is one of the most effective ways in letting your emotions actually move through your body instead of staying lodged in some part of your body. People may use boxing, taekwondo, some kind of martial art, physical exercise like spin classes, etc. Even walking, hitting a pillow, a constructive way of releasing that anger. You have these groups where they're just shaking it out, shaking the hands and feet out for a couple seconds can really be real releasing, real relaxing, because you're actually releasing that tension, that pent up, suppressed anger or another emotion. And that's not a cure, right? But it's a starting point. These are simple starting points. Those are simple techniques, but sometimes those simple techniques may not be sufficient. It depends on how long you've been suppressing the emotion, what type of emotions they are. Sometimes it may be a long while and it may have caused a lot of psychological or physiological problems because you've been suppressing those emotions for so long, which can actually lead into potentially psychiatric disorder and physical illnesses as well. So you may need more intense intervention, the exercise, talking it through with a friend or family member or partner or loved one, a colleague, a co-worker, may not always be sufficient. You may need some other interventions which have been known to work is counseling. Counseling is a really good space where it gives you that freedom to express your emotions in a non-judgmental environment where the individual is a professional. They're not someone that you know or someone who you believe will be judging you. A lot of people find counseling, a good counselor that is, very therapeutic. And if they use them on a regular basis, it really does release that tension, whether it's anger or whatever the suppressed emotion is, sadness, etc. And also, depending on how severe the situation has become, sometimes, not all the time, but people may need more medical intervention because the more simpler things may not work, because suppressed emotion is a serious situation. And I can give an example of the physiological impact of suppressed emotion. Another example is someone who was experiencing severe stress, and instead of expressing the emotions of disappointment, of sadness, what they were actually feeling, they held that emotional weight in. And as a result of that, it manifested as gesticulations or twitching in different parts of the body. And the individual eventually was diagnosed with stress-induced fasciculations, which really was related to the suppressed emotions because of the treatment and the experience they were having and not allowing themselves to actually express their emotions in response to that negative treatment. Men can experience these things as well, but I just wanted to give some examples of women, what women experience, because generally in society, women are not allowed to express anger or they're seen as being really dramatic. It has affected a lot of women because they constantly try to keep themselves calm, keep themselves passive. As I said at the beginning, it's not about suppressing your emotions temporarily and then expressing your emotions in the appropriate way, in the appropriate situation. No, that's not suppressed emotions. Suppressed emotions is about constantly keeping your emotions inside. And that's your defense mechanism. It's more of a continuous thing, and you're not using the other avenues to express your emotions and address whatever is causing those intense emotions. Now, we've spoken a bit about women. Let's talk a bit about teenagers.